Okay, welcome everybody. Glad to have you with us today. We'll have a few more people joining over the next few minutes, but we're really excited to have today's webinar called A Just Transition for Labor, What Will It Take? With our special guests, Dr. Carol Zabin, Shrayas Jatkar, and Mark Kyle. I'm going to put my presentation in presentation mode. There you go. For those of you who are new to the Climate Center, our mission is speed and scale greenhouse gas reductions. A great example of our work is the key role we played in growing community choice energy across California from just 2 CCAs about 5 or 6 years ago to 21 today that serve 11 million Californians with 88% greenhouse gas free electricity. And a lot of our work was with local unions, including local IBEWs, for example, in helping to get these CCAs established. We all remember that very apocalyptic orange sky day in early September, and here's the headlines from LA Times a couple days later. And we really are already in the climate apocalypse. It's no longer in the future, it's here and now. We know that we've already passed 9 of 15 global tipping points, that the situation globally is rapidly deteriorating in terms of climate, and we're experiencing that right here in California. But the nation and the world are looking to us to lead for a climate safe future. And we've fallen behind a little bit recently, even with the governor's new executive orders. We have a lot more that we need to do to accelerate climate action to secure a climate safe future. We need more aggressive policies and accelerated timelines now. And at the Climate Center, we're working with partners across the state on the Climate Safe California campaign, a campaign for rapid decarbonization. Our goal is that by 2025, California will have enacted the bold policies required by science to dramatically cut emissions, start drawdown of the emissions we've already put into the atmosphere, and secure resilient communities by 2030, inspiring global action. So what does that mean? First and foremost, it's about accelerating existing state policies. Right now, we have on the books that we need to get to 80% below 1990 levels by 2050. We believe that we have to move that up to 2030. And we have on the books to get to carbon neutrality and net negative emissions immediately thereafter by 2045. We believe that needs to be moved up to 2030, again, based on the latest science. We would love for you to endorse Climate Safe California. You can go to climatesafeca.org. Our guiding principles for our Climate Safe California platform and all of the policies and programs related to it. Number 1, our policies have to be based on the latest science. Things are changing so quickly. Number 2, we have to ensure a just transition, a high road just transition, which we'll hear more about shortly, for fossil fuel workers and their families and their communities, leaving no one behind. And number 3, we have to prioritize climate justice. We believe climate justice is racial justice. And we want to ensure that lower income communities and communities of color are no longer disproportionately harmed by fossil fuels and the results of climate change. Bottom line is our house is on fire, and we need to ask at every level of government and society, are we doing enough? Because as of today, we are not, and we each need to keep pushing forward for that. So we have a challenge today to reach 30 endorsements for Climate Safe California, a public pledge of support for California to accelerate aggressive, equitable climate policy, inspiring states and countries to greater action for a climate safe Earth. Visit climatesafeca.org. And just some housekeeping notes here. We'll be in a webinar format. You can go to the top right of your screen and select speaker view, which is the easiest way to view this today. Put any questions you have. If you look at the bottom bar, you'll see that there's a Q&A. Any questions that you have throughout the presentations and discussion, just put it in there. If you have any technical problems or links you want to share, you can put that in the chat. I'm again very delighted to have with us today Carol Zabin, Shrayas Jatkar, and Mark Kyle for our Just Transition for Labor, What Will It Take webinar. Just brief bios before we jump into it. Dr. Zabin is a labor economist with UC Berkeley. Her focus is on low-wage labor markets, labor standards, and workforce development. She directs the UC Berkeley Labor Center's Green Economy Program and consults with unions and nonprofits to improve jobs in human services and the green economy. Her recent publications include Putting California on the High Road, a Jobs and Climate Action Plan for 2030 that we'll be discussing today. Other publications include Diversity in California's Clean Energy Workforce, Advancing Equity in California Climate Policy, and Workforce Issues and Energy Efficiency Programs. She was appointed by Governor Jerry Brown to the Executive Council of the California Workforce Development Board. Our second guest today is Shrayas Jatkar, a policy specialist with the California Workforce Development Board. He works to ensure public investments in California's transition to a carbon neutral economy, support high quality jobs, and greater access for disadvantaged workers. He formerly worked as a policy associate for the Coalition for Clean Air. He was a policy intern for the Governor's Office of Planning and Research, and he has been a grassroots organizer for the Sierra Club. And last but not least is Mark Kyle, who will be our moderator today. He's an attorney and focuses on labor, political, and election finance law. He's a former political director for the largest building and construction trades local in North America, the Operating Engineers Local Union Number 3. Formerly, he served as chief of staff for the California Labor Federation and undersecretary for the California Secretary of State. He works on bringing organized labor into the fold of aggressive climate action through major infrastructure projects at the local level, such as the San Francisco Seawall Restoration Project, regional level, Measure AA, and state levels, offshore wind power and high-speed rail. So welcome to our fantastic panelist and moderator today. And I'm going to hand it off to you, Carol, to share your screen now.
Okay, thank you so much, Ellie, for that nice introduction. And oh boy, where did my
Right, if you push that green button down on the bottom bar that says share screen, then you should see
share
your
screen,
PowerPoint.
but the PowerPoint disappeared.
Okay, there you go.
Okay, hold on.
That's all right, take your time. And if you have trouble finding it, we can set it up separately. Can you see it now, Carol?
I can't see it. I can't see. Well, let me share, and then what happens is I can't see the.
Oh, I see. Okay. All right. So let me ask Stacy if you could set it up instead, that would be great. And thanks everybody for your patience. We'll get going shortly. There you go. And if you can put that in presentation mode. All right, Carol, take it away.
Okay, hold on. Okay, thank you so much for the invitation. I'm going to be talking about putting California on the high road. I want to say at the start that I'm a bit uncomfortable with the term just transition. It has a lot of baggage and a lot of history. I also want to say that I don't speak for labor. I'm the author of a report that tries to show how we could make climate policy really supportive of workers and also of unions. And so next slide, please. The report I'm going to talk about was mandated in AB 398, which asked the California Labor Agency to make recommendations on how to really support workers as we implement our climate policy and as California transitions to a carbon neutral economy. And it was really the first time the legislature focused on job quality and job access, sort of de-emphasizing the argument that, you know, if we just produce some net job growth, we're kind of home free in terms of worrying about jobs in a carbon neutral economy. And what the report does is recommend complementary job policy levers that we can incorporate in our existing climate policy portfolio and also future climate policy. So we're not thinking about labor as an afterthought, but we really try to bake in supportive policies into any climate policy that we design or implement, which really we haven't done often. Next slide. So what the report does is look at our full portfolio of climate policies. And as I think this audience knows well, we have over 100 policies that kind of together form the portfolio of what we need to do to get to our reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, our targets for 2030 and 2050. And they range from public investment to command and control mandates to incentives to buy down the cost for the private sector to invest in various types of carbon reducing activities, and our cap and trade market policy. And all these end up affecting a bunch of different industries. Construction really, I think, is by far the most important, because a lot of what we have to do is really rebuild our energy and transportation infrastructure. But it's by no means the only one. This hits all the sectors of the economy, but there are definitely sectors that are the most emitting sectors, and they include trucking, oil and gas, obviously, vehicle, all kinds of manufacturing, particularly transportation manufacturing. And so those affect jobs and affect occupations. And what we have to remember, and what has become sort of crystal clear in this pandemic, is how many of our workers are really stuck in low-wage jobs. We have a low-wage jobs problem in California and in the nation as a whole. So next slide. And so what we did is really trace the climate policies to industries, to jobs, to occupations. And in doing so, I mean, for one, we get away from that old argument that green jobs are really different than other jobs, that they're a new set of jobs. But I think most people have absorbed the notion that really they are occupations that have been around, but that are doing things differently or producing new goods. But a mechanic who works on an electric vehicle still is an auto mechanic and has to know how to fix the windshield wipers, as well as learn the differences between an electric powertrain and an internal combustion engine. And that's true whether you're producing electricity from old sources or new sources. You still need to know what being an electrician is all about. And what we find when we really trace the climate policies to industries, to occupations, is that blue collar occupations are way, way, way overrepresented in these jobs. So most of the sectors who are highly impacted by climate policy have very, very high proportion of blue collar construction, production, transportation workers. Next slide. And blue collar occupations are one of the, not the only by any means, but one of the big sectors where we really have to worry about the low wage job problem. We don't have to worry about that in most professional jobs, but in blue collar jobs, some jobs are good middle class jobs. They tend to be either unionized or public sector blue collar jobs. And some are really pretty crappy jobs. And in the sectors impacted by climate policy, we've seen some high road success, meaning we've produced good jobs and had an impact on climate. And the renewable portfolio standard is sort of our keystone example of this, because it really has driven the increase in renewable sources of electricity, but it's also done so producing good jobs in utility scale. And I want to grid scale. I want to emphasize that. Good career training through state certified apprenticeship, and apprenticeship is just so key here. and also has a really good record in terms of the inclusion of disadvantaged workers. And basically that has occurred because the big solar farms, et cetera, have been produced under project labor agreements, which are, and it's a little more nuanced than I'm saying here, but are essentially collective bargaining agreements on big developments. We've also seen what we call low road challenges, where there are some sectors that climate policy acts upon, and they're really, really messed up sectors before climate policy even got there. The classic one is the trucking industry, where we have truck drivers who are misclassified as independent contractors. And because of that, they are responsible for the main capital in their industry, which is the truck. They're responsible for acquiring and maintaining the truck. And the trucking companies have been able to shift the risks and costs of that maintenance of the trucks onto these very low wage immigrant truck drivers. And so then climate policy comes along, and in this case, it's a clean truck mandate. And these very poor immigrant workers are shouldering the cost of that climate policy instead of being able to spread that cost to the trucking companies, to the retailers who buy the goods that the trucking companies transport, and finally the consumers like you and me who are buying TVs or pens or wetsuits or whatever you guys are buying in the pandemic. I'm buying wetsuits because I love to swim in the bay. So in this particular case, and it is kind of the worst example, not only are we continuing to exacerbate the low road conditions for these workers, but we also can't implement our climate policy because the state cannot enforce and get compliance on folks who have no money to make these capital investments in cleaner trucks. So we have to be really intentional about protecting workers and creating good jobs or improving bad jobs. And we can't just let the market, just say, well, climate policy isn't about equity or isn't about job quality, because it is getting imposed on these labor markets that are very, very problematic. And as Tim Rainey, the head of the workforce board, says, if you aren't intentional, you'll just get what we got. In other words, we'll just perpetuate the huge wage disparities that exist in our economy. And frankly, and I'm speaking now as Carol, not as a contractor to the state, unions see that. Unions see climate policy not always incorporating from the get-go these concerns about labor, and they see a lot of clean energy sectors that are perpetuating the growth of low-wage jobs. So next slide. This is simply a slide showing where we have been successful. The only place we've been really successful is in electric power with big reductions. And that's also where, again, the grid scale renewables have produced very good jobs. Next slide. So the structure of the report, and I'm saying this because it is really meant to be a guidepost or roadmap or whatever is a better term than that, of how you can think ahead and incorporate good labor policies in climate policy design or implementation. So the report does is have 3 tools chapters that talk about the demand side of the labor market, that is, what kinds of investments are we making, both public and private, how policy shaping those investments to produce good jobs, not crappy jobs. And really, this is about labor standards. The second tool is training strategies, but that has way, way, way less importance than what kinds of jobs are getting created. You can't train yourself out of a low-wage job problem, even though most that has been the most common strategy to address worker issues in the climate transition. It's been emphasizing the importance of retraining. And I just want to de-emphasize it. It is important, but it's not nearly as important as other strategies to create good jobs and create the demand for skilled workers. Because without that demand, you can't train your way out. And then finally, how to support workers in declining industries, which is the most difficult. And then what the report does is take those three tools or sets of tools and then apply them to the industries or the sectors that are in our scoping plan, in our climate implementation plan. And the way our Air Resources Board does it, our CARB does it, is divide up the economy into energy, transportation, industry, wastewater, and natural and agricultural lands. So next slide. So starting with the labor standards piece, I just want to highlight some of the low-wage trouble spots where labor standards can improve job quality, and that includes distributed generation. So not utility scale so much, but yes, we have a problem in distributed generation, in big swaths of energy efficiency, in trucking, as I mentioned, in the TNC gig platform car shares, but also in waste management, in fire prevention and forest management, and in manufacturing and ag. So that's where we really have to look at how can we avoid the bad job problem. Next slide. So again, the climate agencies are really, really key in promoting good jobs by adding labor policy levers, which they may not really have experience or know how to even think about. And I'm so glad you invited Shrayas, because one of the good things about this effort by the legislature to ask for this study and get a bunch of recommendations is that the labor agency has really stepped up and begun to work with the climate agencies, who really have way more influence on the job side. And I wish Shrayas had a team of 20, but he really is doing wonderful work in beginning to helping the agencies incorporate these tools. And so just to list a few, and Mark, how much time do I have?
You have 5 minutes and 1 second.
Okay, thank you. So perfect. And the tools differ by industry, and really in construction, we have a set of institutions and policy tools and infrastructure. And the infrastructure is really the state certified apprenticeship system that ensure the high road, ensure good jobs, ensure investment in training, ensure good wages and benefits, and ensure highly competent and highly skilled workers and contractors. And so I've listed some of the tools here. We could get into them in the questions, but this is a sector that has over decades and decades really developed a set of institutional practices in their labor market to promote the high road. There is a low road in construction industry that is predominant in residential construction, where there's enormous violations even of the basic protections that workers have by law, like minimum wage and overtime and et cetera, et cetera. So construction is really, really characterized by a bifurcated situation where the high road and the low road are very, very different. there aren't as many sort of practices and policies and techniques in non-construction labor markets, but there are tools that sort of actually imitate what has developed in construction. So we have inclusive procurement requirements. We have some great examples of the transportation authorities writing in on their bid language when they're going to buy a new fleet of buses, that employment conditions matter. And we can get into the mechanisms. It gets kind of technical, but you can put wage and benefit standards in contracting requirements, even in incentives. You can also put skill standards, saying that you have to have a license or a skill certification enabled to do the work. There's community workforce agreements. There's a whole set of tools. So next slide. Training, again, we could get into this more, but in the interest of time, this is important. We know how to do it. The workforce agency, I think, is doing some great stuff in this area. I'm going to let Shrayas echo and get into more detail here. Next slide. Okay, so job loss. I know you're all interested in that, and it is certainly important. And here's the high level view.
Carol, you have about 2 minutes. to
Okay,
wrap it
so
up.
just transition has historically very, very, very rarely worked. Retraining is not enough. You have to think about job creation, reemployment, placement. This is very, very difficult. We don't have many good examples. Diablo Canyon has been a good example because it was a regulated utility, and so there was naturally a table at which enviros and labor and the utility and the local community could sit and work things out. But we don't have that in the refineries or in oil and gas extraction. Next slide. And so, we have to really fully explore alternatives to plant closures when there are other strategies to achieve greenhouse gas reductions. My reading of the evidence is that leakage is real. We don't want to just import oil and gas. We have to reduce demand because we don't want to just end up moving production outside of California. So there are all kinds of things we can do, but we really need to pay attention to that if we want to. I think if we want to get labor on board, but two, just reducing supply does. We have to confront the leakage issue. The state is beginning to deal with the regions that are heavily dependent on fossil fuels, as work in Kern County particularly. It's so incipient. This really is get down into the weeds and really think about what state and local and federal investments can be done to make workers whole. We have some best practices around bridges to retirement for older workers, serious retraining for those workers who really want to change careers and invest in training. Even if it's paid for, it's still a big investment on their part. And then wage insurance and other things to help out those workers who aren't able or aren't interested in serious career shifts, but need to be reemployed. And it's very difficult that they're going to be reemployed at comparable wages unless there are other types of assistance like wage insurance.
Carol, we're at the end of your time, so if you have one or two more sentences, otherwise we can come back to
Yeah, got it.
some of the substance during the question and
Yeah,
answer
so
period.
this is the last slide, and it's just illustrative of what I've said. There, it really is a high road approach, and if we don't upfront incorporate these labor standards and other strategies, we will, at least in some sectors, get onto a low road approach. So thanks, everybody. Appreciate your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Zabin. Very good presentation. A lot of material. The report is over 600 pages. Your executive summary, which hopefully folks read or at least skimmed, is over 35 pages. Just your last slide alone had a lot of data in it, Carol. And so I want to reemphasize that these materials will be made available to all participants. So if you couldn't read all of those words in that last slide, you'll get a chance to do it again. And it is a good summary of what Dr. Zabin was talking about. Why don't we move over to Shrayas with the state agency, and then we'll take some questions after that. We're getting a lot of good questions. We're not going to be able to address them all. We're going to try to keep it the questions focused on just transition. There's a lot of interesting corollary discussion and corollary questions going on, and we're not going to get to those, unfortunately, but I think we can capture those and they can be saved as well and sent out to participants. So Shreyas, why don't you go ahead and take it away?
Great. Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for having me and having the State Workforce Development Board. My name is Shrayas Jatkar, Interagency Policy Specialist for Equity, Climate, and Jobs. Let me go ahead and share my screen. All right. Great. So love the conversation and this topic. The Climate Center has posed this question for us, perhaps rhetorically, just transition for labor, what will it take? My response is it'll take a high road vision for California and for developing a carbon neutral economy, which is our goal by 2045. So hopefully, as I present today, it'll become clear what we mean by a high road vision, as well as a high road approach to workforce development, and what we're actually doing about it as state government. So first, let me start by saying a little bit about who the State Workforce Board is. We're probably one of those agencies that a lot of folks are not familiar with. We're one of the 7 entities within California's Labor and Workforce Development Agency under the helm of Labor Secretary Julie Su. Folks who are following political news might have read that Secretary Su has been mentioned as a possible appointment as Secretary of the U.S. Department of Labor, which would be very exciting. And of course, that'll play out in the weeks and months ahead. So we, as the California Workforce Development Board, we're responsible for the oversight and continuous improvement of the workforce development system in California. We do that by developing policy, investing in innovative workforce development programs, and by assessing the performance of workforce programs and organizations. Other entities within the agency have similar roles, but we're really in the lead when it comes to setting workforce policy for the administration and overseeing the local workforce system. And so that's why I say, in short, we're the workforce policy arm of the administration. One of the ways that we advance workforce policy is by developing what's called California's Unified Strategic Workforce Plan, or the state plan for short, or let me say the state workforce plan is intended to guide state policy and practice across different partner agencies and organizations, as well as to really inform and shape local policy and workforce service delivery. As I mentioned, we're one of 7 entities in the agency. There is a plan afoot to reorganize the agency to consolidate the different entities that also have workforce services within their mission. So as you'll see here, the other entities in italics, the Employment Training Panel, the Division of Apprenticeship Standards within Department of Industrial Relations, and the Workforce Services branch of the Employment Development Department, or EDD. These four entities, including us, there's a plan afoot to consolidate us into one workforce development department to streamline services and policy, and really to orient the workforce system at the state level to that high road vision that I mentioned. Very quickly, let me just say that there are 45 local workforce investment boards in California. They're cut up along county lines for the most part. We at the state, we do not regulate them per se. We're not a regulatory body, but we do issue policy and data directives that local boards must follow. Local boards, they really are the entities that oversee the delivery of workforce and business services, like job training and job placement assistance that are relevant to their local residents and businesses. And they oversee the local one-stop career centers around the state, which are really the hub of statewide service delivery for the workforce, for the education and business services. And then lastly, I want to say that in the past, the State Workforce Board was essentially a pass-through for federal workforce dollars to the local boards. But under the executive directorship of Tim Rainey, who's the ED of the California Workforce Development Board and has been here for almost 10 years, we've increasingly developed and administered our own funding programs. And we have a lot of great results to share about those, which I won't be able to go into today. But of course, if there are questions about those programs that particularly are relevant to our climate change mitigation efforts, I'd love to talk about those. So let me turn to explaining a little bit about this high road vision for California's economy and our approach to workforce development. So the high road is a conceptual framework of the kind of economy and society really that we want to live in. And as such, it doesn't really lend itself to coming up with a simple definition. I think it's more helpful to sort of paint a picture to shed some light on what this concept of the high road means. So let me say it this way. You know, there are two ways to make money in this economy, the low road and the high road. The low road is where businesses only consider profit and loss. Workers are treated like roadkill and the earth like a sewer. The high road, by contrast, is where businesses compete based on quality and innovation. Workers are considered an asset instead of a cost, and businesses actually capitalize on investing in the workforce. And they treat the earth, they care for the earth like it's the only home that we have, because it is. Lots of money make money on the low road. Lots of firms also operate on the high road. So really the challenge here is that nobody thinks, or at least says openly, that they're on the low road. And yet it's the prevailing operating mode of our economy. As Carol pointed out, we have a proliferation of low wage jobs in this economy, and that's not by mistake. And so really, therefore, the high road must be paved through deliberate policy and programmatic interventions to change what is business as usual. And I really, compare this or liken this to how we achieve our environmental goals and our environmental and climate justice goals, right? We don't just have greenhouse gas emission reductions appear magically. We don't just have greater environmental equity that just happens on its own. It takes deliberate effort, strategic interventions, and the same thing needs to be done to address the market failures of our current economic system. So let me say a little bit more about the high road. To us, we define it based on 3 pillars and a set of practices. So the 3 pillars, as you see here, are equity, climate, and jobs. To start with equity, and here we're really talking about economic equity. This is about building economic opportunity and mobility for those who have been marginalized, disadvantaged, or otherwise denied opportunity. Climate sort of is somewhat self-explanatory. This is all about mitigating and supporting adaptation to climate change, increasing environmental sustainability, and building community and economic resilience. And lastly, jobs. What we mean here is a practice of engaging with the state's high road employers to increase quality jobs and design skills answers to their shared needs. And I think what's very important to convey is that we cannot achieve greater economic equity if we don't pay attention and if we don't grow quality jobs. Connecting people to any job is not going to do it when it comes to addressing gross disparities in the economy, income inequality, wage disparities along racial, gender, and other lines. And so again, we need to be very deliberate about creating quality jobs because as Carol pointed out, that's not our status quo. When in terms of practices, what is a high road approach to workforce development? It really comes down to developing regional, sector-based training partnerships. This is where employers, workers, and labor market intermediaries come together. And really the idea here is to flip workforce development on its head. Typically, when you say workforce development, people think of training and a training program, or they think of a particular population and figure out some way to run them through a training program. The high road approach starts by identifying where the jobs are, where there are good jobs, and then developing training pathways up and into those good jobs through these training partnerships. As I said, it's sector-based. It's going industry by industry, not just company by company. And it's doing this on a regional scale because, as we know, economies are largely organized at that scale. One last thing I'll say is the high road approach also is about building on what works. Rather than creating sort of niche or boutique training programs, this is really thinking hard about where are there good existing training pathways and how can we leverage those. An apprenticeship, registered apprenticeship in the building and construction trades is a prime example of that. And our High Road Construction Careers Initiative has been an example of how we can stand up and develop a clean energy workforce that is skilled and diverse by essentially developing a skilled and diverse construction trades workforce. Be happy to say more about that if there are questions about that, because I think it's a great example of, again, the kind of systems approach to developing a workforce that supports carbon neutrality.
Shrayas, you've used up your 10 minutes, but I'll give you another minute or so if you can wrap it up.
Okay. Let me skip ahead. We have a 3-point implementation plan to really take action on the recommendations in the AB 398 Climate and Labor Report that Carol just mentioned. As you see here, job quality, equity, just transition. These are the sort of 3 main baskets of what we at the Workforce Board are doing to address climate change. And I don't unfortunately have time to explain the how and the what we're doing here, but again, happy to say more during Q&A. So if you don't mind, I could just take a few minutes, Mark, since I'm just getting to sort of the heart of our topic today, just transition, and do want to say a good bit about that.
You got a minute and 30 seconds.
All right. So, about a month or 2 ago, Governor issued a zero emission vehicle executive order that calls for phasing out internal combustion engines, which is a much needed policy signal here in the state, and builds on the great work we've been doing to transition to zero emission vehicles. That executive order also tasked the Governor's Office of Planning and Research and the Labor Agency to develop what's called a just transition roadmap by next July, and to implement that just transition roadmap that should be consistent with the recommendations in the AB 398 report. The just transition roadmap, that work is just beginning. So we definitely, I'm tasked with representing the Labor Agency and working closely with, again, the Governor's Office of Planning and Research, which is taking the lead on this. We'll be working together. Absolutely, we're looking for public input. We don't have exact plans yet as this work is just getting underway, but we definitely will be thinking about what that public input looks like. And of course, it's all hands on deck for implementation. So with probably 30 seconds, let me just give a quick hit on what we think is sort of our framework, our sort of conceptual framework of just transition. We think there are 5 main baskets: economic development and diversification. I think the emphasis has to be here. 2, this is about safety nets. This is addressing worker supports and layoff packages to cover, income and retraining assistance, early retirement inducements. This is, negotiations that happen at a individual facility or firm level. Industrial policy and planning. This is critical to make sure we're addressing the change in industries that we want to see to support carbon neutrality. This is about addressing the change in work, in products and outputs that encourage more of what we want and less of what we don't want. And as Carol mentioned, workforce development really kind of comes at the end. We want to make sure that there are good jobs to replace the ones that are leaving. Otherwise, there is no just transition. So again, the emphasis is really on economic development and diversification, which we think needs to happen at a regional scale. And undergirding all of these efforts are developing regional and industry partnerships, very similar to the partnerships I mentioned before. Employers, labor and workers, community interests, local government, workforce and education intermediaries, all are essential to, and others are essential to furthering any goals or objectives within one of these other baskets. It's a big undertaking. It's complex. As Carol mentioned, it hasn't been done well before. So we need to learn from the past and build on the good models or the good examples, I'd say, that have sprung up in terms of coal-fired power plants and the Diablo Canyon in terms of a nuclear plant. There are good examples of pieces of just transition, but what we're trying to undertake here in California is a much bigger undertaking that's going to require a lot more thinking and hard work. So,
Shrayas, okay, good. Thank you. I don't want to cut you off, but we want to save a few minutes for questions. We've got a lot of great questions. We're not going to get to them all. We'll try to answer some of them. Good job. If I can ask the Climate Center folks to post links to Shrayas's work site and information available through that state agency, and to Carol's report if it's not in there already, so people can go back and review those. I just want to touch on a couple of labor issues. There's, I believe, outside of the labor community, a belief that organized labor is monolithic, and it's monolithic in how it perceives climate change and the potential loss of jobs. And that's not the case. There's been a lot of collaboration between organized labor and environmentalists and state and local communities on pro-climate change efforts. Measure AA regionally in the San Francisco Bay Area is one great example. The San Francisco seawall restoration is another great example. And that doesn't mean that environmentalists and organized labor haven't gone toe-to-toe. The same agency, Save the Bay, that was the promoter of Measure AA for restoration, habitat restoration around the Bay Area and cleaning the bay, also went toe-to-toe with construction and building construction trades on Redwood City's salt marshes and salt flats. So there's a history of butting heads, but there's also a history of collaboration. But given that most people in organized labor just want to do what we all do: show up, go to work, do their job, get paid a decent wage, be treated with respect, not get killed or injured on the job, so having safety standards, saving enough money for retirement to be able to live with some respect in your the last part of your life, and have decent health care. There's sometimes a perception that organized labor is completely resistant to action on climate change. And I'm going to throw you kind of a curveball here to the two panelists, but the State Building Construction Trades Council of California has been very instrumental in articulating and bringing labor standards to the table and enforced on huge climate mitigation projects. I can think of at least 3 utility scale solar panel projects outside of Fresno that the state building trades helped negotiate labor standards for. But that agency has also butted heads with legislators, with legislative leaders, and with the governor. So, how do you see collaboration occurring to accomplish the goals that need to happen to address the climate disaster that Ellie so articulately pointed out to us, and these standards? This is a great intellectual framework for moving forward. How do we do it in a pragmatic way? Carol, I'm going to toss that to you first. Then Shrayas, if you have anything you want to add, please keep your answers simple because I want to get to a few more questions. Carol?
Well, collaborations are based on relationships and long-term relationships. So I think the example, example of AB 841 that just passed, which supports retrofits in schools, but also puts a skill standard on electric vehicle charging stations for the whole state, a skill standard that the IBEW developed that aligns with apprenticeship. It's not only union, but it certainly aligns with apprenticeship and uses that wonderful infrastructure. And it will result in most of the work being good jobs. That was an environmental and labor collaboration. You do have to find the win-wins. They're not all there, but I do think even when you get to the hard stuff, which is, the trade-off between a good refinery job and, the pollution that refinery causes, those are the really, really tough trade-offs. But, sort of both sides recognizing when it's possible to come together, when it isn't. And also, recognizing, on both sides, sort of the truth telling when your policy really does result in cost to the other interests, rather than just papering over those difficulties, but rather, coming together to get a bigger solution to the problem, which requires long-term.
Okay, thank you. Shrayas, I'm actually going to give you a different question.
Okay.
There was a lot put forward by both of you. Clearly, your state agency is working on it, but where's the money going to come from on this? If we're talking about putting in standards on the supply side, or the demand side. We're talking whichever side. We're talking about putting in standards. We're talking about creating jobs. We're talking about transitioning jobs, retraining people, training new people, developing pipelines for disadvantaged communities. We're talking about a lot of money. Where's that going to come from? And is it feasible, given that we're probably going to go into a Trump/coronavirus induced recession over the next several months? What does it look like going forward? Are you optimistic, not optimistic?
Well, I'm optimistic that we can still achieve some good progress despite the broader economic situation that we're in, because California invests billions of dollars annually in climate change mitigation efforts in a number of different venues. And part of my job, or the big part of my job, is working with state agencies, developing partnerships that control those dollars. Entities like the Public Utilities Commission, for instance, which oversees billions every year spent by the utilities on energy efficiency and increasingly transportation electrification, right? That money has terms and conditions to make sure that we're achieving the environmental outcomes. Our point is that the same way we should be setting terms and conditions about labor and workforce standards so that we ensure those investments lead to good quality jobs and create greater access to them for disadvantaged populations. I remain optimistic because having been an advocate in the past and now working for state government, I've seen the conversation shift from this isn't our responsibility, or we don't have authority as a energy climate agency to help us, how do we do this? And again, a lot of agencies are mandated by different rules around environmental equity, and they're trying to look at how do we now sort of extend that to jobs? How do we ensure that low income, people of color, communities that are disproportionately burdened by environmental pollution, not just have access to electric vehicles and solar panels, but the jobs to build those materials and install them. And what we're saying is that you can't have economic equity if you don't pay attention to job quality. And we're working closely with those agencies to develop those standards. And to the cost question, I would say that at least at a high level, in some ways, higher labor and workforce standards could reduce costs. The more you bring in skilled workers performing that work, the more likely you will actually achieve the energy savings and the emission reductions that we all expect from these investments. There's a lot more to say about project labor agreements and community workforce agreements that come in, on time, on budget. This cost argument, I don't want to oversimplify it, but again, it does take a sort of reimagining or rethinking and reframing our mindset around what we pay for and what we get as a result. Oh, you're on mute, Mark.
Carol, given the reality that that Ellie pointed out in the beginning, that we are in climate crisis mode right now, and that it's only going to get worse, and that the science every week comes out with new studies indicating that one, they miss the timeline. It's actually climate degradation's occurring much more rapidly than we anticipated, and that we realistically have 10 years at best to actually put the brakes on things before it all goes to hell in a handbasket for future generations, our children and our children's children. How do we accelerate some of the programs that are being proposed, given that a lot of the climate change laws and regulations and goals being set aren't just for 2030, but they're for 2045 and 2050. We don't have until 2045 and to 2050. If we don't do it and step on the gas or step on the electric pedal to 2030, then we may as well just walk around with gas masks permanently. We're getting training for that now. How do you see accelerating that transition, Carol? Is it possible, given what you just came out with in this report? Can we move it faster and make it happen faster?
Well, I think all of us on this call are trying to figure that out, and I don't have silver bullets. The one thing I will say is, we obviously need a national labor policy. And to do that, we need to build a broad coalition. We're not going to get there without labor. And so I do think the value of this report is to after we recognize, and I think Joe Biden has recognized, that we need to be talking about good union jobs. Obama used to talk about green jobs, and he didn't have the word good, and he didn't have the word union in there. And so I do think there's a real political recognition of the importance of a broad coalition that includes workers and includes their elected representatives, their union leaders. So we need that broad coalition, and the value of this report is it just goes into detail of how we can make real that promise of good union jobs in each of those many industries and sectors and climate policies that they're really, even after you make that political commitment at the top, there are so many small decisions. How do you structure an affordable housing program which is designed to reduce vehicle miles traveled? That will also produce good jobs. I mean, there's, over 100 policies in California, and how many programs? Shreyas is supposed to go to each and every one of those programs and see, are they supporting workers or not? And it's a big job. But so 2 points: one, we need the political coalition, and two, we need the how. How do you do it in each of the policies that are designed to reduce emissions in each of the sectors that are now emitting greenhouse gas emissions?
Can I chat real quick to just say that I think to support this just transition relationship building endeavor, we actually do need to accelerate climate policies for the sake of dealing with emissions, but also because I think folks will come to the table when they actually see the writing on the wall. And so far we've had, again, numerous policies, programs, et cetera. But if we're not addressing the supply, the production of fossil fuels, in California, we're talking about largely oil and gas, right? Like those policy signals aren't yet translating into market signals. And so to actually bring folks to the table, I think we actually, we need to be more aggressive. And I think that'll help, make it real, the transition that's happening, and actually open up the dialogue for what the transition should look like and how we shape it so that it is in fact just. As we've seen in the past, that has not been the case, and we've paid for that as a result collectively.
That's right. So it's 12:01. We're going to go an extra 4 minutes. Folks are starting to drop off, so I just want to say we're going to go an extra 4 minutes. I just want to point out two things from an organized labor point of view. One is that in Europe, organized labor is at the table with government and with business to develop these plans. And that hasn't happened in this country. So Ellie is right. California is setting the example, and we have to set the example by being engaged in a collaborative process. There's a lot of areas we didn't get to talk about today. A lot of questions about oil and gas production, how you transition those jobs, whether those jobs can be used to cap. Do leakage coverage for, and a lot of those jobs aren't transferable necessarily. Just because they're construction, it doesn't mean as a sheet metal worker working in a refinery that I can go out there and now cap things out in the field. So there's clearly still an area to grow in terms of understanding labor from an environmental climate activist point of view. And I think a lot of organized labor, the California Labor Federation, the state building construction trades, which is very active in securing jobs and in promoting climate mitigation, they need to engage with environmentalists and with climate action activists. So real quick, 30-second answer: how do environmentalists and climate activists do that from your point of view, Shreyas, and from your point of view, Carol? 30 seconds each.
Yeah, I think it's for enviros, and I speak as an environmentalist myself, somebody who's worked for Sierra Club, supporting labor standards on clean energy or anything that's climate change mitigation, adaptation, resilience, is a way to ensure that you're also addressing the interests and the needs of labor. As stated a number of times already, good jobs don't just occur magically. We need to be deliberate and intentional about making it so. We need to demand that. And public agencies who are investing in climate change mitigation are in a very unique position to set those kinds of labor standards, workforce standards on their money. We do this all the time.
Right. Thank you. Carol. 30
well, I'll
seconds.
speak to environmentalists because that's this audience. And I would say, supporting, as Shreya said, supporting labor standards and really working with all kinds of labor, because, right, labor represents different industries, on big investments, big public investments that can accelerate climate change, and then you can put labor standards on. So, where there is a stimulus plan, for example, nationally, let's make sure that enviros support all those labor standards in it. And hopefully at least some of labor will support the green and climate mitigation strategies in it.
Thank you. Ellie, I'm going to turn it over to you for any closing
Yes.
comments. Thank you, everybody.
Yeah, well, thank you, Mark, for your great moderation. Thank you, Shrayas, for all the work you're doing on behalf of all of us in California. You and your team really appreciate it. And thank you so much, Carol, for your leadership and all the excellent research and communications you've done to move this forward. We're grateful to all of you. Thanks, everyone, for attending today. Just want to thank Janina Turner and Stacy Meinzen, our staff who've been behind the scenes here to make all this work so smoothly today and to help set this up. We welcome everybody again to endorse Climate Safe California at climatesafeca.org. We will have the PDFs from today's presentations and the recording of this webinar available by tomorrow at theclimatecenter.org/webinars. Thanks again, everybody. Be well, be safe, have a good holiday, and looking forward to having future webinars together. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.